In the Baltimore sports world, you'll get it first on the WNST text service. That is brought to you by our friends at Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. We got a great guest here. I love having authors on. I love having real journalists on. This is a guy that I've been a big fan of for a long time. I don't think our paths have ever crossed. If they have, I beg your pardon, Tom Rinaldi. But I'll tell you what, it came to my desk that you got a book, a life, a choice, a legacy. The book is called The Red Bandana. And as a guy who's written a couple of books, first off, welcome on. I hope you're well rested for this book tour. And, the thought of a book, it comes to people in the middle of the night, and you're obviously very inspired by this topic, right?
Yes, Nestor. Thank you very much for having me. I've certainly found the task, and I don't know if you did on your end, but I found the task enormously daunting. We each have day jobs of different kinds, and they come with their own demands. And to sit down and think, well, we're going to try to tackle something outside the day job per se, even though it ties to it, and tell a story in the narrative style and the venue purely of the written word, without the visuals of the sound that come with television, which are inestimable in their advantage, was daunting. But ultimately, it came to be, and we've been very fortunate. It's been well received. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list the past couple of weeks, and we're really encouraged by that.
Well, what gives you, you walk into these stories all the time. I do too. I've been doing this 32 years. Every day, there's an amazing story somewhere. People ask me all the time, when are you going to write a book about your wife's journey in leukemia and saving lives? And I'm like, well, I know what it's like to sit in a room. It's a very solitary thing for a guy that's type A, that's outgoing, that has another gig, that runs into 100 other awesome stories every year that could be a book or should be a book. But then there comes the time where you sit and, my books have been about the Ravens championships, you know what I mean? A thing moves you and you say, okay, I'm going to spend 3 months in a room, and sometimes it's 6 months. John Eisenberg comes up. He spends 24 or 30 months at a time working on a book. I don't know that I could pour myself in for that long. I'm a sprinter, not a marathoner, but you've had a million stories. Why this one?
Some stories we tell, this, Nestor, from your own life experience, but also from purely your professional taste. They just never leave you. And we originally told the story of Wells Crowther, the man in the red bandana, as a television feature for ESPN, about 14 minutes long back in 2011. I think a couple of things happened that sparked this becoming a fuller narrative and finding its way into a book form. One was the reaction to the story, which really surprised us. We tell stories all the time, but the reaction to this one seemed to be different. Number two, so much happened since the original telling of the story 5 years ago. And number three, there was so much material that we couldn't get into a television feature, even at that length. All of those things, I think, added up to exploring it in a book form.
Well, give us a little synopsis of this for people who aren't familiar, didn't see the piece in 11, or haven't seen any of the media you've done for the Red Bandana, which is new New York Times bestseller, and Tom Rinaldi of ESPN here. So this story becomes a book in 12 or like in 15 after you tell it? Because when you talk about reaction to a story, you feel it, right? Especially if you're out in social media, if you're walking the streets for 6 months, if everybody comes up and talks about the same story, you've touched someone.
That's right. The story in brief, Nestor, for those who don't know it, and there are many, many who don't, is centered in, but not completely by any means, about 9/11. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, Wells Crowther was 24 years old. He'd been an outstanding athlete at Boston College, a Division I lacrosse player. He'd been a volunteer firefighter because he idolized his dad, and that's what his dad had done. But upon graduating, went into banking and was working on the 104th floor of the South Tower for an investment bank, Sandler O'Neill, when Flight 175 tore through the building. He made his way down the only functional stairwell, Stairway A, made his way down to the 78th floor, a sky lobby where express elevators had let out as many as 200 people who were getting locals up to the highest reaches of the tower. And he saw a scene that he simply couldn't pass, a scene of horror, which is described in the book. So many who were dead and dying. He emerged onto that floor and led a group into the stairwell, including picking up a woman and carrying her across his back down nearly 20 flights to where the air was clear and he felt they could continue to make safe passage downward. He then made the choice to go back up and do it again. He led a second group into the stairwell. They made their way down. Ultimately, Wells made his way down, too, all the way to the ground floor and the lobby. He still did not leave. The book traces the reasons as to why he didn't and where he was found, surrounded by firefighters from the FDNY as the only civilian, essentially, in this area of the lobby when his remains were recovered in March of 2002. It traces in the first part of the book where that sort of character comes from, that courage and valor, if it's something that can be known, what happened on 9/11. And in the third part, the clue, Nestor, of that red bandana and how survivors pointed to it, which pointed his parents toward their own detective work journey, if you will, through their grief to find out what their son had done in the last hour of his life.
Incredible story. Makes you want to read the book. The book is The Red Bandana. Tom Rinaldi, longtime journalist at ESPN, writing a book. It is a New York Times bestseller. You can Google him. You can Google it and Penguin Books and everything else that surrounds this story. 9/11's fascinating in a lot of ways. I mean, we all remember where we were. I was nationally syndicated. I was supposed to be on that flight a week later. I had been on the Newark flight about 3 weeks before out to Los Angeles and Chicago in my work. And, Bruce Springsteen did a whole album on it. 15 years later, still sings The Rising almost every night. I know Adam Schefter is a partner of yours and a dear friend of mine, and his tale was told a few weeks ago that I knew about with his wife, who was a widow from 9/11. But the 9/11 story, there could be 1,000 books about 1,000 people, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 people involved in all of that. For you to find this story and this story came to you, I mean, it must feel like a calling when you sit and start to piece this thing together as a journalist, huh?
When the 9/11 Museum opened in the spring of 2014, and for anyone who hasn't been there, I would really suggest going. It's a deeply moving experience. The president dedicated the opening with a set of remarks, and 2,977 souls perished in those attacks. The president symbolically chose to mention only one by name, because it was impossible, obviously, to begin to catalog and describe all the families and lives lost and the impact on our nation. The one name he chose to mention was Wells Crowther. This story, for what it symbolizes about how the country, in its own way, through the lens of a single life, answered that crucible of terror that day, Nestor. And Jeff and Alice and his parents, in their own journey through their grieving, have been remarkably strong, but also steadfast in constantly mentioning all the other stories of heroism that we may never know, because the lives that performed them were lost, and those acts were lost along with them. This is one story we do know, but for that clue that survivors pointed to, not knowing their son's name, never having seen him before, but talking about a man who had covered his mouth and nose with a red bandana, something he'd carried since he was 7 years old when his dad gave it to him on the way to church services one morning. And again, while it's centered in 9/11, Nestor, I think it also revolves around a choice and a question. The question is something I think we all ask ourselves in the quiet of our own hearts at some point. What would I do? How would I react if the mortal moment reached me in this way? Not to take care of my family or my children or my loved ones, but a stranger, a group of strangers, people I'd never seen before, whose names I didn't even know. Would I put them before myself? This is the story of someone who did, an ordinary man in many ways who did something extraordinary in answering that question and making his own choice.
Tom Rinaldi talking about his book, The Red Bandana, and of course, you'll be talking golf here, and certainly outside the lines. And for journalism, I've been at this 32 years, and I know the way I was trained in the 1980s. And Lord knows you had a far better education than I in the Ivy League than I did at the University of Baltimore. But the whole part of journalism and where we are with this political election and where we are in the world of sports. I'm a journalist that had my press pass taken away 11 years ago by the baseball owner here. I tend to think there's very little journalism left in sports at this point. There's generally just bickering between owners and agents and the money. It's usually the money talking to the money, and wherever you fall on that side with whatever alphabet soup you work for, when you work for networks that are associated with leagues, there does become a conflict of interest. And I feel like I see it all the time in the way news, or what we call news, is portrayed from not just your network, but every network. I mean, just across the board, there are a bunch of people who fund those networks who get very antsy when real journalism is being performed.
I don't think there's any doubt. I think it would be very naive, Nestor. You enunciated that very well. It's naive to think that the intersection between commerce and editorial, church and state in the parlance of journalism, is a smooth one. There's a lot of turbulence there, and there are a lot of interests which come into collision when journalism and investigative work and the discovery of an unpleasant truth that may damage the interest of a league or a player or a team is brought to light. And when that happens, it becomes a question, I think, of a very simple question, Esther, and that's just, what's truth? What is the truth in this situation? And in sharing that truth, having the faith in the fanship, the viewership, the public, to make its own judgment. I do think there is a growing chorus of opinion makers, and we understand that, but I also think sometimes we don't give the public and fans enough credit to judge on their own terms whatever they will about the teams and the leagues and the players that they support in the way they do.
Well, I would also say, just moving that to the political realm, everyone gets a vote there. Whether they think Donald Trump's lying or Hillary Clinton's lying, or they trust one or they don't trust the other. I mean, trust and accountability are brought into this in every way. I mean, the biggest story we've had here in recent times, obviously, was the Ray Rice story, right? I mean, when you talk about, were the Ravens telling the truth? Was Ray Rice telling the truth? Was Goodell trying to cover it up? Was he currying favor with Bisciotti? You guys got involved in it. Every reporter gets involved in it. And in the era of social media, and I'll bring this to you because you're one of the 3 people left on earth that doesn't have a Twitter account, and I would ask why from a journalism standpoint, but I also understand that social media makes all of this like whatever the truth is right here, right now is the truth until, I mean, it's almost like sort of that backwards justice where you're guilty until proven innocent in the realm of social media, and everyone has to be first. Right doesn't necessarily factor into this, or truth, as you've pointed out, doesn't necessarily factor into getting it first.
In terms of Twitter, Nestor, the truth is I should be on Twitter, and I'm not. Like you have a crowded life, Nestor. You have a lot going on in your life. I have 2 young children, and my life, I feel like, is crowded enough that I don't necessarily need Twitter, certainly, as an outlet to share my thoughts or stories. I'm fortunate to have other venues to do that. But I'll also say, Nestor, that it does have great news value in many instances. Sure, there are negatives to it, but there are also big positives. The reason I'm not on Twitter is not a positive. It does not reflect positively about who I am as a person. I don't know that I possess a thick enough hide to deal with Twitter. And so as a result, I simply don't engage with it. The very first tweet, without being on Twitter, anybody ever sent to me involved it is a very specific one. It goes back to when Roger Federer played Andy Murray in the Wimbledon final. And if you recall, Nestor, there was a rain delay, and the roof closed for the first time on center court in a men's final at Wimbledon. We, meaning the executives at ESPN, made an interesting and a bold decision as to what to do with those 20-plus minutes of delay in the second set. We had done a feature on Andy Murray. Many people did not know his story then. They probably still don't now. Murray and his brother Jamie grew up in Dunblane, Scotland, and were in Scotland's version of Columbine, if you will.
Really?
Where 16 kindergartners were killed by a deranged gunman and a disgraced scout leader from the town. They hid under their desks while the shots were being fired in the gymnasium where those little children and their teacher were murdered. We had Murray never speaks of it, Nestor, not publicly. And we did not interview him for the piece. We did interview his mom and the terror that she felt. Judy Murray's a very prominent figure in British tennis as a coach of her own right. But the story was about whether the pursuit of a Wimbledon championship could mean anything in this town where the very worst thing had happened. And we discovered that it meant more than we ever thought it would, even for families who had lost children, for the hope that it would present, and for the notion for other citizens, Nestor, that, sorry about the length of the story, but that
we tell stories here. Tom, we're radio. We do that here. We love storytelling. It's good. It's what we do.
The town could be known for something more than the place where the children died. It could be known instead as the birthplace of a child who grew up to win Wimbledon. Murray did not win that match. He lost to Federer in 4 sets. But when we aired it, there were a lot of people who had not seen the story prior. We had shown it once before, but certainly not to that audience, an audience of 5 million. And in doing so, it wrought strong reaction. The one tweet that was forwarded to me by a friend of mine, ironically, was brutal in its assessment as to how inappropriate it was to show the story when all this viewer wanted to do on his Sunday morning, presuming it was a man, was watch tennis, not to learn the tale of murdered children. And I am stating it far more softly than was written in the tweet. Right then and there, I decided I would never be on Twitter, which is petty and thin-skinned and small. But
I take enough abuse for you too, Tom. Don't worry about it, man. I'm out there. They're all shooting at the messenger. You know what I'm saying? I'm just a guy here trying to tell the truth, right? I mean, the hardest part, I think, and I'll leave you with this and your thoughts on this, is being called a liar when you're in the business. And your integrity and your track record for as long as you've been doing it, as long as Outside the Lines has attempted to do it, and Real Sports and all the other places where you really do try to tell a true story, and you're charged with that. When you're called a liar, that's a really tough thing. You know, I've been sitting here telling the truth for 32 years. Anytime anybody calls you a liar, your first reaction is, really? I'm the accountable one here, you know? I'm the guy here who comes back every day and takes the phone calls and takes the inquiries, but that doesn't matter in the new world. It really doesn't.
All you can do, Nestor, you would not have endured and done the things you've done in this business if people didn't find a value and a credibility. And I'd even say, and this is a wonderful thing about radio, and even more broadly about the great privilege of telling stories, of a comfort with a reader, a listener, a viewer. Because in a sense, you're a guest in that person's car, home, in a case of a book, you know, in a plane seat, in a lap, being held in their hands. You're a guest in their consciousness. And there's a beauty to that position.
There's a responsibility to that position, too.
There is. And the fact that you endure the way that you have shows that people find value and truth in what you share.
Well, and I think to say, you know, for you and all that you've done, keep up the great work, keep finding great stories. I think it's fascinating that you picked this one to write the book about. Any more babies being made on the book side? I mean, it really is that moment of insanity where you decide, yes, I'm going to do the book. You know, I'm wondering what the next story is that compels anyone to sit and do this for long stretches of time, because less people are reading books, which I find to be a real shame, you know?
But there are, again, we're fortunate that the book has made the Times bestseller list, the last few weeks, and we're grateful for that. But also, I'm encouraged by the fact that, again, at a time, you touched on this, Nestor, of such division and discord, that perhaps there is, in its own way, a piece of common ground that's being recalled from the immediate aftermath of those attacks about the unity that people in this country experienced and the pride that people felt. And I think maybe the story has touched on that and touch something in people to a certain degree. I certainly hope so.
It's a book about courage. It's called The Red Bandana. Tom Rinaldi, longtime journalist at ESPN. Great to have a real journalist on the program. Tom, keep up the great work, man. I really appreciate you taking a little time. Congrats on the success of the book, and I can't wait to get a hold of it.
Thank you, Nestor.
You got it. Tom Rinaldi from ESPN. I would say you can find him on Twitter, but you can't, and he explained why. But you can find us on Twitter at WNST. Luke's on the backfields in Owings Mills, as always, preparing for Ravens action this week. I am Nasty at WNST.net. Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and streaming live across the world on our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNSTV and WNST.net AM 1570. Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.